Hey there, conversation creators, and welcome to Just Write Already, the short show for new authors to create pop fiction that means something.
It's filled with tips, real life stories, and listen carefully, because at least one piece of advice in this episode will actually be good.
We're helping you break free, get better, and write wilder so that readers can't put your story down, even if they should.
Dominic is an aspiring bigwig who was born at a very young age.
Katy is an absolute Spider-Man recruit. She's afraid of spiders and dry ice. But yeah, not really.
We're novel writers and story lovers who really need to stop talking and just get back to writing.
So today we are talking about talking. It's about dialogue, part 1. What makes good dialogue? Makes bad dialogue? And hey, why is it important? So Katy, why don't we start with what makes good dialogue?
So, good dialogue is dialogue that sounds natural, it brings your characters to life, and makes you forget that the world you're reading about is fictional. It should make it feel like it's a real world and the characters are real people that you could actually meet on the street and have a conversation with.
And it's funny how hard it is to actually capture that in writing. It's kind of like riding a bike for the first time. We talk all the time. It's like, and then you're riding a bike, and then you stop and you pay attention to what you're actually doing, and you look down, and the bike wobbles, and you fall over, and it's like we talk every day, all the time. Then we go to write about talking, realize, oh, it doesn't work the same way. So, why not? Why does it feel so clunky and clumsy to actually write dialogue?
Yeah, I think part of the reason for that is because, especially writers who are still developing, or especially if you're writing a screenplay, it's even worse, is that people feel obligated to use their dialogue to give information to the audience. And you can use dialogue to give information to the audience. And in the case of a screenplay, sometimes you have to. But that's never really the ideal way to do it. Your dialogue should really be more about making your characters feel real, making your characters connect to each other, building tension, building relationships, things like that. Exactly what dialogue does in real life, right? It helps people bond. You can threaten people with dialogue. Whatever it is, dialogue should really function in your story very much the same way it functions in real life. And you shouldn't try to make it something else.
It's very much about, sharing what someone is thinking about something, or what somebody thinks about somebody else, or is trying to get help, or trying to get understanding for something. I think it's called info dumping, and it can either happen in your body copy in the prose, or it's almost worse, I think, when you do it in text and you have 3 pages worth of, and here's the history of our lands, as you know. Well, if you knew it, why are you saying it? So again, coming back, before we get into what makes it bad, but coming back to good dialogue, you don't even notice it. It's almost effortless, isn't it? It just feels like, oh yeah, that's exactly how people sound. Why is it when maybe we're starting out, it doesn't feel like that? It seems to, I don't know, it seems to go on and it doesn't feel effortless. What is it that we're not exactly doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think people just feel obligated to do things with dialogue that they just really don't have to do. Or it also can be that people are trying too hard, especially in their first drafts. Like they think, I need my dialogue to sound epic, or I need it to, I need it to really like create the world. And dialogue can create the world, but I think people just tend to think too hard about it. They don't, at least for your first draft, just let your characters talk naturally, the way you would have a conversation, with your neighbor. And then you can always go back and tweak it later if it doesn't sound quite right, but don't feel the need. I'd say don't overthink it. Don't feel like your dialogue has to do things that real conversations wouldn't do.
Yeah, I think a really good piece of advice, we see this in almost every movie, and it seems effortless, while we're watching the movie, and we're like, oh, of course. But notice how in so many movies, there's almost always 2 characters in a scene. Why? So that they can talk to each other. It helps you get out of your head and not monologue inside your brain, which you have to be really, like, you have to have an incredible voice and something to write about for it to, to actually stick that landing. But invariably there's like a friend, somebody at the bar, a talking sword, there's like a pet on your shoulder, and you're talking to it, and you're using that thing to get you to talk about the scene in actual dialogue. And then part of that magic is, again, to avoid that info dumping, avoid trying to make dialogue just another pillar of, I need to tell stuff about my story. It's like, no, dialogue is about people talking to each other. And I think one of the keys then is to stop feeling like, gotta make it sound like real life. Because when you actually go to write dialogue, how do I say this? When you're a writer, you're writing something that is very fake. Real people might not actually talk like that. Real people are going to include lots of ums and ands and run-on sentences and oh, and by the way, and then you modulate your voice because you had an extra little idea. But then you come back to the main point. You actually try to write that out like a dictaphone, or I'm probably dating myself here, transcription thing, and you get like 3 paragraphs and like nobody, it feels weird because you actually talk like that in real life. But we don't think conversation works like that. And it's a lot more, what would you say, short sentences, lots of back and forth, and usually not agreeing with the other person. Like if everybody's agreeing in every scene, that's not prompting good dialogue, because half the time it's like an undercurrent of argument to sort of get you to think and reveal the character a little bit more.
Yeah, so there's sort of a balancing act, right? Because on one hand, as you say, you don't want to, if your dialogue is too realistic, right? Then, I call you up to ask you, what time the party is. Now, before I can ask you what time the party is when you pick up the phone, first I have to say, hey, Dominic, how you doing? How's your family? How's your kids? What's the weather like today? And then, 10 sentences later I get to, so what time's the party on Saturday? Which was the whole reason I called in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. So on one hand, if you do all of that, which is very realistic and natural, it can really be boring to your audience. On the other hand, if your dialogue is too unnatural, it makes it unrelatable. So there's certain things you can do, right? Like you can put an occasional or in the dialogue. Just make sure it's not as much as would be in real life, right? And use it strategically. Maybe you're trying to make some awkward tension between your characters, right? Mm-hmm. Or you can also summarize things. So in the phone call example I just gave, like if I wanted to make that realistic, I might say, Katy called Dominic. They talked about the weather for 5 minutes before Katy said, Dominic, I need the information about the party on Saturday. So you just summarize it in one sentence. So we know it happened, we know the characters feel real, but the audience doesn't have to be bored listening to every single thing that we said.
Yeah, exactly. And again, all of that, maybe you could air quotes call it white noise. It's the kind of stuff that we talk about in real life because we're trying to assess what is the emotional state of this other person? What's their mental state? If they're a stranger, it's like, I don't know who you are. How are you going to respond to some basic personality test questions? How's the weather? What's life like for you? Do you like ice cream? With your friends, you just skip past all of that sort of stuff. But in a story, if you are going to include it, then you have to be intentional about it. And when I say intentional, that would mean, for example, if there's a ticking time bomb going off and this other person keeps asking pointless questions, well, then it actually kind of matters, Or if you don't know who the other person on the other end of the phone is, or you're meeting them in a mall or something, then these questions are not just pointless questions or just setting the tone. You're actually trying to find out stuff about the other person. But if you have 2 people who know each other really well, summarize it, or maybe move past that stuff quickly, get to the stuff that's important, and then if you are going to include it, understand why it's there. Because if it's just like, oh, I'm trying to be realistic, like The Great Gatsby, maybe, or some of those older novels from 100 years ago where conversations go on for ages and they talk about everything, written for a different audience, maybe, different expectations of dialogue today. It's not only, I think, a lot tighter, but I think we expect more to be revealed about the characters. What kind of state are they in? What do they want? What are they afraid of maybe from the other person? What are they hoping the other person's going to say? So we're starting, like, we're talking a little about like good dialogue. Let's go in to talk about more about the bad dialogue. And you already started hinting at that, but so what makes bad dialogue, Katy?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get into tips for dealing with all of this stuff in the next episode specifically, but for for bad dialogue, oh my goodness. So my old writing teacher, right, Professor Riley, used to call it the cliff of exposition, which is when he would put notes on people's scripts that said stuff like, "You've just fallen off the cliff of exposition," when essentially you would have a block of text where the character says, as you know, the world has been suffering from coronavirus for the past 2 years. And, would just go on this whole thing about, like, stuff that's happening in the world that nobody would ever talk about in a real conversation because everybody already knows it. 90% of the time, if you start a dialogue with "as you know," you just need to scrap that whole sentence because that's going someplace that...
I'm pretty sure that in the beginning of Chronicles of Shannara, Al-Anon sits down with the main hero. It's been years since I've read it. And he says basically something like that, like, "as you know," and then he info dumps for 4 pages. And I'm like, this could have been 2 chapters later, after we get on the road and the stakes are set and why the hero is committed and stuff. Because it's like, cool story, hit the brakes. Like, yeah. Wait, why? Don't hit the brakes now. Put on the jet fuel. We need to keep this thing moving. So yeah, careful about falling off the cliff.
Falling off the cliff of exposition. And the other thing about it, too, is when people do this, they oftentimes will just do a massive, like a paragraph that's not broken up. My general rule about writing dialogue is if the quote goes longer than 2 lines, you need to have some sort of descriptor about what the character is doing. So, he says something, goes on for 2 lines, he stops, he ran his hand through his hair, and then, you continue with the rest of the quote. But you have to have some sort of sentence about the character's body language, about their tone, about, maybe they're washing a cup or something to give the reader a picture of the actual thing that's happening. If you just put a block of quotes, if somebody just talks on and on without breaking it up at all, that is major snooze worthy. That is, I am putting your book down right now.
That's a study hall session. That's not a dialogue. So interject. Have the other person have something to say. But notice, one thing I think we'll all see in any movie, when there's a dialogue or conversation going on, the characters are always doing something, like you said, washing a glass. If you can have your character, I think, do something in the dialogue or do something that enhances the dialogue, like, for example, we're talking about, so you're going to date my daughter, huh? That's great. So who are you? And he's polishing his gun quietly without making any reference to the gun. Now we've put a whole flavor to the conversation. It's got a particular tone, or characters are always walking around, or like key thing in lawyer movies, walk with me, right? And they're moving, pushing through doors. Important people are always signing things from nameless people walking by with clip pads, or walking you through a map, or so have the characters actually be doing something and allow that to break up your, if you have to do it, your info dumping.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of different ways to break it up and make it interesting. If you need to do info dumping via your dialogue, which you can do, but especially in a novel where you can do it more in the narration, that's a better way to do it. There's we're going to do a whole separate podcast on how to do exposition well, as in how to give the audience information well. But as a general rule, you don't want to rely on your dialogue too much for that. Your dialogue is about building relationships between your characters and making your characters feel real.
There you go. So that is why dialogue is important. It's about making people feel real, communicating who they are, what they're interested in, what they're not, why they're not, and how they relate to other people in the scene, or what they're afraid of. It really is, I think, especially in the first act, they're often highly emotionally charged. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of worry, there's planning, there's bravado, there's pointless talk, there's laughter, there's chatter. It's not so much about the information, it's about who are these characters, because we got to follow them. through the rest of this story. Well, there you go. I think that wraps our dialoguing about dialogue today. We'll follow up in the next episode with tips on, well, more tips, things that you can do, things that you can think about to actually improve your dialogue. So thanks again for skipping your second cup of coffee to listen in. Who am I kidding? You've had 2 cups already. Half the time we don't know what we're going to say in these shows, but hey, it's got to be good. Your writing life could depend on it.
Well, not really, but one of these episodes might just explode your brain with an idea. You'll write a story and completely change your life.
Definitely some of the things that we talk about did that for us. So hey, let us know what you think. Please rate us 5 stars.
Or we'll steal all your coffee and you will have a caffeine deprivation headache.
Well, there you go. Now we are dialoguing about our inner lives and how that's going to affect you. So subscribe to this podcast at catholicauthor.us. Now that we're done, you can begin. So just
write already.